All right. Welcome to the December 12th, 2011 work session. Work sessions are a more informal setting to update the council on business items. No votes will be taken on work session items. Tonight we've got 5 items on the agenda. Public comment is allowed that is germane to an agenda item. If you wish to speak and you are required to fill out a public comment card and turn it in to the city clerk staff. Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of each item. Once the item is called, no other public comment cards will be taken. Sudi, do we have any public comment?
No, sir.
Okay. Would you please sound that first item?
First item is discussion regarding draft list of city charter areas to be reviewed by the Charter Commission for consideration of a final list to be approved at the January 9th, 2012 council meeting. This is presented by Chris Lauerblum.
Mayor and Council, I'm not used to standing out here, but I'll do a little public comment tonight. I want to be able to see y'all because this presentation is going to be on the screens. And,
could you give your name and your address?
Yes. Let me give you a little framework for this conversation, and then we'll have it and see if you have any questions. The resolution that you all adopted at December the 5th, I believe that was, 1 week ago tonight, directed us to provide some information at the work session in December as to our thoughts with respect to the charter and maybe some areas that we would ask the Charter Commission to look at. You'll note that the Charter Commission, having been created, we will have an opportunity potentially in January to adopt a resolution with some direction that you all might want to provide them, and that they will kick off work as early as January 15th with substantive type work. That's also to say that I'm working on scheduling a meeting with them prior to the Christmas holiday just to kind of get some of the housekeeping issues out of the way. We won't work on anything substantive, or they won't, based on your direction in the resolution, but just know that we're working at trying to get them together. I also want to be mindful of the fact that by us making some recommendations of things we think that they should look at, those are things that they can or might look at. Obviously, it's an independent group, and they have the ability to look at what they want to look at. But I think having lived and breathed this document for the last 5 years, both with its strengths and occasionally its weaknesses, we can provide some framework by which we want them to at least not overlook things, and certainly they can look at whatever they want after that. My disclaimer going into tonight as well is that I, as well as your staff, looked at the charter and tried to look at it through a certain set of glasses. And the glasses that we looked at it through were glasses that said, are there things that we've dealt with in the first 5 years that we think could be more efficient? Are there places in the charter that might have conflicting information or otherwise things that just should be cleaned up? I'm not standing before you tonight advocating that I would suggest that any of these things be changed in the charter, just that I think they warrant a further look. And certainly some things have been more problematic than others. So by going through these slides tonight and by me kind of framing where I think there's things to look at, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden we have to agree that, yeah, we've hit the nail on the head and we found all the right spots. But I would welcome your feedback as to things that maybe should be or should not be considered for the appendix that will be attached to the resolution that you all will consider in January. So, having said that, there's the disclaimer for the night. Let's grab the first slide. I don't want to spend long on it. Just want to remind you why this Charter Commission's even come to be, and that was as a part of our charter in Section 7.18 that said that you all would call for one at the first regularly scheduled meeting in December. You did that. Those members are appointed, and Dave, if you could go to the next slide, those members are appointed as follows. It's a 5-member commission, and they will commence work mid-January. They have a deliverable that is due 6 months from December the 5th, and that deliverable is due back to the General Assembly. So, all right, so let's go to the summary of areas. Dave, if you'll go to the next slide, click it one more time for me. These are the areas that we will talk about tonight, at least that we've come up with, and some background behind them. I'd like us to look in order here at the millage rate cap that is in the charter, some powers of the mayor, the method in which ordinances are adopted, the salaries of the elected officials, term limits, how contracts are executed, the powers of the city manager, the selection of the mayor pro tem, and then some minor items for consideration. All right, let's go to the next slide, Dave, millage rate cap. This is addressed in two sections in our charter. It's in section 1.12, which is definitions, is definition number 40A, as well as in section 6.11. As you all are aware, the mill rate is fixed at 4.731 mils, and the critical language in here is that unless a higher millage rate is recommended by resolution of the council and approved by, and this is where the underlined importance comes in, majority of the eligible voters of the city by referendum. Now, practically speaking, that is a near impossible thing to occur. That is different than a majority of the voters that vote. That is a majority of the eligible voters that are registered in the city of Milton. So, in essence, even though that leaves some flexibility, practically speaking, that really leaves no flexibility, and that may be okay. The thing I want to point your attention to is we are just in the process, as you all know, of moving forward with public safety facilities on Highway 9, moving forward with bringing on board a financial advisor for the city of Milton. And one of the things we consistently hear is that we will struggle with a superior bond rating so long as that mill rate is frozen in, or for all intents and purposes, frozen in the charter. Certainly not standing here to advocate that you all would, make a recommendation or ask the Charter Commission to look at that in the hopes that you could all of a sudden use it to raise that mill rate. That's not what I'm standing here saying. I'm just saying that practically we are going to have some issues we need to battle through if, in fact, that strong cap stays in place. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Dave, if you'll click it one more time, a red question is going to come up. And I've put a red question on the bottom of each of these screens. And I'm kind of trying to gauge your feedback as we go through this as to what direction we might give the Charter Commission or ask them to look at it further. And the question I've asked here is potentially consider language that, while restrictive, is not so restrictive as to be practically impossible. I don't know if you would agree that that would be the direction we would like to give on this item, or if this is one of the items you would even like them to look at. It's probably fair as we go through this, just so I don't have to come back at the end. If there's any objection to them looking at the item I brought up on this slide, I guess that would be what I would be interested in at this point.
I'm not objecting, but I just want to make sure people are aware of the fact that, because I wasn't until we went through the annexations, that if you register to vote here in Milton, you will be kept on those voting rolls till you have not voted for 7 years, unless you register to vote somewhere else in Fulton County. So 50% of the registered voters in Milton may not even live in Milton anymore, because if they have been kids that have registered to vote when they turned 18 or something and have moved away from home and are no longer living in Milton, they will still be kept on that voting rolls for 7 years unless they have registered to vote somewhere else in Fulton County. So yeah, where you said it was almost impossible, it may actually be impossible.
I think they can be dead, too.
Yeah, oh, they can be. We ran into that when we tried to annex. It's hard to get signature from somebody who is no longer with us.
If we can figure that out, you let me know.
They do in Chicago.
Okay, you ready to move on to the next one? Okay. The next one we looked at, and this is probably one procedural thing and then maybe just some clarification. It would be worth potentially having the commission look at the powers that are assigned to the mayor. As you can see in section 3.21B and C, it suggests the mayor has a veto. Although if the mayor were to veto an action of the council, it requires a simple majority to override the veto, which, for all you're shaking that, right.
That doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make any sense. So that's why, to the extent that exists, the practical effect is that the mayor could veto something and a simple majority overrule it. The veto itself then doesn't really, it either needs to be clarified or not be in there, I would think. Other thing that this is one of those procedural things that you'll see a couple of times is in 3.22B4, it suggests the mayor is the only person that can execute contracts, and that's great. Although contracts, even if it were to be up to a certain dollar figure, the efficient operation of government would seem as though there should be somebody should have the authority to execute a contract, even if it's a modest dollar figure, just to keep purchasing decisions moving forward. And the other one that we came up with is in section 3.22B8. It suggests that the mayor would appoint city council members to oversee various departments of the city. We haven't done that yet, but then there's also a section of the charter, as you're well aware, that speaks to council's interaction with staff and who that is through in the council manager form of government. And I don't know that this necessarily doesn't conflict with that. Probably worth a discussion. May stay in, may not, but these were the things as we were looking at the section that dealt with the powers of the mayor that appeared as though they could withstand some clarification. Having said that, I also ask and would certainly welcome feedback from the mayor if he has any recommendations. But Dave, if you'll hit the button one more time so the question pops up. The question is maybe consider these three sections and possibly strengthen the power of the mayoral veto, place a different mechanism in place to execute contracts, which is more efficient, and then maybe either consider the removal of either Section 3.22B8 or Section 3.28 if, in fact, they conflict. And that'll be a discussion that the Charter Commission needs to have. We on track with that one? Okay. Next slide for me, Dave, please. Ordinance adoption. This is one I just bring up because Carter brought it up when we were sitting in our meeting talking about this as a roundtable, and if we were looking at it through the efficient glasses, there's nothing that says that we have to, as a matter of law, have two readings on 2 different days to adopt an ordinance. There are places that adopt ordinances at one presentation. Now, I can also see the counter-argument to this would be that, by having 2 reads and presenting it to the public at least twice for their review and comment, that appears to be potentially more transparent than trying to put something on and approving it in one meeting. So I don't really, if you're asking for Chris's opinion here, Chris doesn't have one. I just want to bring this up to the extent this might warrant Charter Commission review because there is a potentially more efficient way to navigate through the adoption of ordinances. If you hit the question, Dave, for me, I said to consider and evaluate if this is deemed important. And do any of y'all have any comments on this particular issue? Is it something you'd like them to look at or something that's a non-issue?
What you're suggesting here, Chris, is that the additional presentation somehow slows down a process that needs to be sped up, or do you think it's just overkill, or what?
Well, the way the charter is written at this point is it requires 2 presentations publicly, and it requires that those not occur on the same day, unless, in fact, it's an emergency. Now, we've taken it a bit stronger by saying those 2 days happen to be 14 days apart. Now, make no mistake, we could do it one day and then the next day if it was really that important. There's just, Ken, Ken and I talked about this a little bit. It's really just, we do it that way because the charter says we have to do it that way, but we could just present it once. There's nothing ill or improper or illegal. If the charter were to allow one presentation and then that be adoption, it would speed up by at least a day, but in our case, practically about 14 days.
Right.
More than likely, these issues, ordinance issues, will come up in work session. Is that fair to say?
We do, as a matter of practice, discuss probably 90% of the things we bring forward in ordinance form and discuss it as a work session. Example is those 2 ordinances that are being discussed tonight.
Right. So if you have a first presentation in work session, then the second presentation, you really have 3 presentations.
You've got, yes, I would say there are multiple opportunities for you all to weigh in, the public to weigh in, modifications to occur so that what is adopted, if it's adopted as law, has been publicly vetted.
Y'all will tolerate hearing my thoughts on this. Chris and I did discuss it. And clearly Chris is correct that if the charter only requires 1 public presentation, then that's all you need, and that ordinance can be adopted pursuant to law. I tend to be a believer in, I like the 2. And I'll tell you why. Because the maximum opportunity for public involvement, they may miss it if it's only on 1. And if you have it on 2, it allows at least folks to have the opportunity to come and speak their mind. Worst thing I have seen is something that gets adopted, and then sometime later, maybe during the enforcement phase, suddenly people become aware of what has been adopted, and then they get upset, and then you all are like, wow, not you, but councils and boards generally are like, wow, I wish we'd known about that before we adopt. So most times you can have the public to become aware of something. I tend to like that, but it's certainly up to you all.
In all reality, it's just an opportunity to announce you know,
That's
2 weeks
exactly.
prior
That's right.
an agenda item, because there's no discussion. It's not like
Yeah.
folks are going to come in and comment on it or whatever.
But it's on that
First
physical
reading.
piece of paper, and it's on your website one more time, is the point. So.
Well, we're not making decisions, we're just throwing things out and letting the Charter Commission make decisions, right?
Basically, what I'm looking for tonight is if there's anything that I am presenting that you all would not like to see come forward in January as Appendix A to the resolution saying council would ask the Charter Commission to evaluate these topics. Like, if you don't want them to look at this, then I'll take it off.
I'd just say as long as we have the opportunity, you know, if there is an emergency, that we can do, you know, the rest of just normal, ordinary business, don't think it's a bad idea, as Ken said, to just have it on there twice so folks have the additional. Anybody else?
I agree with that.
I would concur. I think having two is pretty critical from a transparency standpoint, and I think because you have an emergency opportunity now, you know, you could do it back to back, but
Sure. Okay, so kind of what and now I got to give the other disclaimers. Just because it comes off of the list that's going to be attached to the resolution we adopt doesn't mean they won't look at it. But I will take this one off of
I don't
that,
think it needs to necessarily come off the list, but I think maybe you could reword it down at the bottom so that it doesn't look like we want it to be necessarily a change, but then just to evaluate it, because I believe that we need to have it heard twice, but if the work session may qualify as one of those hearings, especially because when it's on the agenda and we're not discussing it anyway, it's just there.
Understood. Okay.
a quick question. As these go forward, though, is this being presented as a list of what staff and the council wants to be evaluated?
What I envision is I envision a couple of things. One is I envision this is the deliverable that responds to the resolution that you all adopted a week ago that asked the staff to bring forward ideas in the work session in December.
Right.
I hope that this list is either, that you all either agree with it, add to it, or remove from it so that I can refine it so that when we write the resolution that you all need to look at in January, that resolution has been vetted to the point that I think you all will support.
I guess I just wasn't clear on this one.
And I guess we need to be aware of the fact that they may not even look at this, and don't have to, correct?
That's right.
I'd almost say, not arguing with Karen's point, but if this item, for example, is not something that we see that the council wants to change, I don't know that I'd even have it on there because it may lead them to think we might want it, even though we say at the bottom, look at this, but we don't really want it to change. It's just my opinion.
Okay.
I agree with that.
I agree.
Got some head nods? All right. Cool. Got it. Next slide, Dave, please. This one's totally up to y'all. Term limits. They're in the charter. As you know, the mayor and council members, that term is 2 full 4-year terms. Is that something you would like them to look at, I guess, is the question. I know it's out there, and I've heard people discuss it. That's the reason it's made it to the list. And I guess I will leave it up to the council as to whether that stays as a part of the resolution that we will consider in January.
My personal opinion is that I'd like to see them doing away with term limits or extend them. That's just me.
So that would require a look at it. Is it?
I think in general, term limits is something that's very popular in terms of political discussions right now. What terms are and what are the limits, I think, are the debatable items. So like the mayor said, maybe we should look at it in terms of how do we package that. But I think that having term limits is a good idea. What those are, maybe that could be up for discussion.
Okay. Head nods there. Another one that's totally up to y'all. If you'll flip for me, Dave. The charter specifies salaries of elected officials. Specifies the mayor's salary, specifies the council salary. And I'm not saying or suggesting that you all would want them to look at this for the purpose of anybody benefiting who is sitting in front of us tonight. The charter is pretty restrictive, though, insofar as that it actually lists a dollar amount. It makes no reference to being amended from time to time, evaluated based on, market conditions. We could be 30 years from now, and these 50 years, 100 years from now. I mean, the charter is the document by which you breathe existence into the life of the government. So Is this something that, I guess the question is this language so restrictive that you would like them to at least look at it? Or are you satisfied with it being specific as to the dollar amount and just leaving it alone? Again, not suggesting that anybody sitting here would jump up and say, I want a raise.
I would say I brought this one up, but, and only, again, as Chris says, not for anybody sitting here or myself or whatever, but just, as we move on 10, 20 years from now, it may need to be adjusted with the cost of living and to be relative with other cities. So that was the only reason I thought. Again, I don't think it would be very popular to anybody that's sitting elected to try to enact a change during their term, but it may be fair to enact a change for future terms. So, again, I like the idea of just having it be not a specific number, but reviewed, and, basically look at other municipalities that are similar. And, they may decide they need to go down, they may decide they need to go up.
Well, I think that's the point. On the flip side, they could suggest that they reduce the salaries too.
Is this the only review that this charter is called out, this 5-year period, or is there further out periods?
This is the only one that the charter actually mandates, meaning this charter commission exists for this one time to do this one review of the city's experience and make recommendations within 6 months. That's not to say that the charter is not amendable from time to time. It does take, obviously, an act of the state to do that. And they are in session every year. So, but this is the one time where the General Assembly, particularly those representatives and senators that district lies in Milton, are looking for this independent body to come forward with recommendations. So it's a long answer to say, no, it's amendable, but it's not. There's nothing that's saying it's got to happen.
A 10-year and
Right.
a 20 or something like
That's
that.
right.
Well, I think that any literal values such as this that we know aren't going to hold forever need to be subject to some kind of language that allows us the flexibility to make them practical for the government that exists 50 years from now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, whatever it is. So it seems a little. It was probably expedient at the time that they wrote it to just put those values in there, but it doesn't make sense now.
Okay.
Agree.
Good. Next slide, please. Contract execution. I said I already mentioned this under the powers of the mayor, but I think it's important enough to mention again because this is one of the things that I really would like them to look at. Again, even if it gives, if you'll hit it one more time for me, Dave, the question is to ask them to consider authorizing somebody else to execute contracts, even if that is bound by a cost not to exceed. If you'll hit it for me, Dave, so the red question comes up. Oops. Oh, it's already up. My eyes just aren't seeing the red versus the black. Okay. I really would like them. This is the one thing that it seems small and minor, but this is the one thing that causes our consent agendas to be as long as they are. That every $1,000 contract that's simply just the purchasing of some inflatables for the Roundup event. That would seem to be that would seem that should be able to be made as a purchasing decision as opposed to an act of the council.
Agree.
All right, let's talk about the city manager as it's related there. This is one of those that I live and breathe every day. You're going to chuckle when you see that. I think that maybe there's a couple of things where the powers of the city manager should be tightened down a little bit in the charter. You probably would think I would come to you and say I want to have more flexibility, but I recognize that this is a review that is not only for me in this position at this point, but whoever is in this position in the city moving forward. One thing where I do believe there's a conflict, and that's in Section 3.25 and 4.10. 3.25 suggests that the city manager has the authority to hire department heads, but in Section 4.10 it suggests that the city manager doesn't have the authority to get rid of them. And that's a bit of a conflict that I've got the authority to bring, or whoever the city manager is has the authority to bring folks on board, but it takes an act of the council to get rid of them. I would think that in the true council manager form of government that you all would like that aligned. It would seem to be that is a more true delivery of the council manager form of government. Again, just a couple of cleanup things in Section 310C and 310D. There's some sections that speak to the day-to-day direction of staff, and Certainly, we want your input in how we operate. I just don't want there to be sections in that are in conflict to that section 3.28. So I think that just needs to be explored on a level that the Governor's Commission can do. And then section 4.15. It suggests in section 4.15 that the mayor and council are responsible for writing the rules and regulations that deal with personnel policies. And I would suggest that that's not necessarily bad, but I would suggest that you all should have the approval authority, but not necessarily the responsibility for authorship and ownership, and that section would more appropriately be written that you all direct that to be done as opposed to doing it yourself. And those are just some of the things that I'd like them to look at with respect to that section that deals with the city manager. Is there any opposition to that? Okay. One other section, the selection, next slide, Dave, selection of the mayor pro tem. We just have two sections in the charter that conflict, and I think that needs to be looked at. One suggests that the mayor pro tem is selected and serves a 4-year term concurrent with the mayor. There's another that suggests that the selection of a mayor pro tem occurs during each election. The practice has been for the mayor to appoint somebody in conformance with 3.11 as opposed to 3.29. I don't know that either of them necessarily is right or wrong. They just both should be the same. So that's what I'm looking at the Charter Commission to evaluate here, is whether or not 3.29 and 3.11 can be brought in line to match each other. Any objection to that? Okay. I also want to bring forward just some minor items as we were putting them through. These certainly don't, I haven't risen them to the level of these first slides that I've presented to you. But I do want to run through them real quick just to give you some idea as the staff as we look through to try to clean a couple of these things up. Section 1.11 defines our corporate boundaries, and I'm not exactly sure what the Charter Commission will want to do with this. The definition of our boundaries as a municipality relies upon the fact that the counties that surround us, as well as the cities that border us to the south, have appropriately identified their boundaries, because it references from a point leading up to another adjoining municipality. This is probably a cumbersome and onerous task to go through these 7 pages and see if the legal description of Milton as it exists today is written correctly, and I want to see what the Charter Commission wants to do with this. We certainly want it to be as accurate as it can be. I just don't know if we can get this done within a 6-month period, so we'll need to look to the Charter Commission to see if that's important to them. There's just a couple of cleanup sections in municipal powers by virtue of the fact that we've brought up pain management clinics and other documents that you all have addressed. There's certain things that the Charter gives us the authority to regulate in Section 1.12b, and the suggestion might be that it is to add things that we all have added kind of to our radar screen in the last 5 years. In Section 2.15, prohibitions, speaking about ethical type issues, it uses the term valuable gift, but it doesn't define valuable gift. And it's one of those things that's a valuable gift is kind of different to a lot of different people. So, to the extent that becomes enforceable, it would be nice to have a definition. Section 3.12 appears to us to be very vague, dealing with inquiries and investigations. Next slide, Dave, for me, please.
Chris?
Yes, sir.
On municipal powers, today we're not limited in creating or changing ordinances that are related to businesses that aren't listed in the charter. In other words, pain management is a good example where we came up with a concern, we addressed that concern through some ordinances that we adopted. So why does the charter have to specify exactly what businesses need to be regulated? In other words, if that doesn't control what businesses get regulated, why is it in there?
Well, here's kind of what the charter does in that section. Is it specifically in whatever that section was, 1.12b.
Yeah.
It lists out a bunch of different specific things.
Right.
It's not in the list of specific things. The way we get to the point that we can regulate it is under that umbrella of health, safety, and welfare.
Okay.
So the moratorium you put in place was for health, safety, and welfare purpose, where if it were specifically spoken about in this section, it doesn't have to fall under an umbrella clause. it's identified.
Well, the reason I ask is because, we don't know what businesses are going to need regulation 10 years from now. So if the only way to get regulation on those kinds of businesses that we don't know about today is to have them in the charter?
I don't think it is.
Okay.
And as we were going through this is one of Chief Harrell's.
Then I'm okay with it. That's fine. Yeah.
Just makes it clean. Okay, next slide. Codes and codification. I wanted to look at this because in the last 5 years we've got some technology enhancements in place that really have made a couple of these sections relatively obsolete. This talks about how fast things have to publish, where the copies have to be available to the public, at what cost they're available to the public. They're available to the public immediately and free at this point with our codification process through Unicode. So I want to look at this and just make sure technology hasn't moved out in front of what the language of the charter says. Here's section 3.23B, dealing with the city manager appointment qualifications, compensation, and removal. Frankly, I think the timelines are just too long. If you've read in that section, if it's me or anybody else that's in the position of city manager, there's almost a 90-day window that goes into, a 90-day window that allows you to make that decision. That to me seems too long. So we'll look at that. Boards, section 4.11 and section G, and these are the boards that you all appoint members to. It says that you all appoint them as a majority of council, although a majority of council can only remove them for cause. And I don't know that board appointees, that should be something that you abdicate to having to rise to the level of cause. I think that which you all as the council and mayor put on a board, you should be able to change because these are more or less volunteer appointees. Wondering if in section, here we're probably getting into too much of the detail, but in section 8, should the critical position holders being the ones that are required by the charter, which is the chair, a vice chair, and a secretary, it doesn't speak as to how often those people are subject to re-election, and maybe that's something worth considering since the charter speaks to the fact that they have to exist. It maybe should speak to the fact how often they are considered for those positions. And then the question was brought up by one of our staff members as to whether or not there should be a clause dealing with board member attendance. We haven't had a problem as of late. Attendance is up and great. We did go through a bit of a period of time where we were having a problem seating quorums, but we really had no direction as to how you deal with appointed board members other than to replace. What would be the criteria by which they would automatically, be able to be replaced without it taking a big official act to the council. So we'll look at that if you're okay with it.
I'm sorry, quick question. Don't the bylaws of those individual boards help to dictate that?
Some of them do.
So
Some of them are silent on the
consistent right
issue.
now, so some do,
Some
some
do,
don't.
and some are silent on the issue. But if it was controlling here, it would be controlling across them all.
I just would think that it is important for members to attend meetings.
Agreed. All right, last slide, y'all. We're almost done with this. Section 6.24, 6.28, two sections that deal with budget. They put in a time frame that just is not realistic based on the world. It requires the budget and capital improvement budget presented to the council 60 days prior to its adoption. That 60, I believe, should be more appropriate than 30. That certainly then would be in conformance with budget calendars as we start to put budgets together for that October 1st date. And finally, section 7.16 dealt with transition. This was a whole section that specified how we would transition from Fulton County to the city of Milton. That transition has, effectively completed. And, excuse me. So I don't see that there's any reason to have a transition plan in that is already done. So this was kind of a staff pass at the items in the charter that we would maybe recommend that the Charter Commission take a look at, with the exception of the one that deals with the ordinance adoption, and I got that, and I'll get that out of here. I guess to the extent that I'm looking for direction tonight, it's just to say that works, that doesn't work, I'd like to add. If there's something that I missed that you all think is important that we need to get in this list for this resolution in January, I'll take some notes.
Yeah, Chris, in section 1.12.B34, retirement, it's a one-sentence item. It says to provide and maintain a retirement plan for officers and employees of the city. I'd like the commission, if possible, to look at how they can add some wording in there to the effect that such planning, such financial decisions have a predictable impact on the city's budget. Because although this is, probably not something that we have to worry about short term, or heck, even in the next 15 years, at some point in time in the city's future, this is going to become something that is of concern to everybody, and putting a little bit more into it other than we'll just provide a plan, I think is important.
Tell me the section one more time. It's 1.12.
1.12.B34.
Okay. Agreement? Is that good?
It's fine.
Okay. Good. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
One other thing in Article 5.11, judges, it says that the chief judge shall serve a term of 4 years, coincident with the term of the mayor, but may be removed for cause by a vote of 5 members of the city council, or upon action taken by the Judicial Qualification Commission. To me, it shouldn't have to be for cause. I mean, very rarely in Georgia do you have to see people, with being a right-to-work state, it's not, you don't have to have cause. And I think sometimes it's easier if you don't have to have cause. If it's time to make a change, it should be time to make a change, and you shouldn't have to embarrass somebody by saying what the cause is.
Okay.
You could probably just,
And I don't know that it needs to be 5 people. I think it just needs, I think we ought to look at that whole 5.11D to see whether or not that needs to be looked at.
you might could just take up the for cause on there and just say it can't be removed.
Yeah, but maybe just by a majority of the members of the city council. I mean, nothing else on ours requires a supermajority, I don't believe, so. But I just think, whatever they decide, but I think that's just something we ought to look at.
Okay. Yeah. There's some things that popped in my head that relate dropping that to a simple majority and equating that with the power of the mayor's veto. The mayor could appoint somebody all day long. So we'll look and see if there's a way to affirm a mayoral appointee that maybe is easier to change, so that you might not have to have cause. Yeah. Let's.
To me, it just, you don't see having to have cause for issues like this in most situations.
The JQC's involved. There's probably going to be cause, but.
Well, yeah, that's a given, but
Is that right, Ken?
Yeah.
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 Okay. Anything else?
I got something.
Bert?
I don't know if this is necessary or if people would agree, but I would like to maybe see them consider having set another time for another commission or review. 10 years out or whatever that number is. I think there could be a lot of things that need to be changed but don't necessarily get the undertaken. But if we have it where it's a certain time frame that it gets reviewed again, then it's specifically looked at.
I'd almost suggest 5. Just a lot of things change in 5 years.
I agree.
Good one.
It's a good exercise. It gets us back into the document that created us in the first place.
Especially when it's got, finite, within 6 months it's got to be submitted and it's not just a long process.
All right. Well, good. That's helpful. The next time you will see this is kind of cleaned up and attached to a resolution in January that we'll kind of make this a list, and then we'll deliver it to the Charter Commission and let them commence their work. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any public comments?
No, sir, we do not.
We'll just call item number 2 then, please.
Discussion regarding the use of MARTA offset funds, presented by Carter Lucas.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Council. If you remember back in 2010, the city was awarded a grant from MARTA in the amount of $613,000. Those grant funds were intended to be used to enhance the MARTA transportation system. And part of the use of those funds is we had to get a list approved and included in the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Plan. And at that time, rather than restrict ourselves, we created a list of 7 projects. I'm speaking from this memo here that you should have in your package. Those 7 projects added up to $1.65 million, so a little bit more than our $613,000 grant. To date, we've done 4 of those projects. Those project totals added up to $431,818, which left us with $181,182 to finish off that grant. So what I wanted to do was come tonight to have a little bit of discussion on the remaining projects, which ones that we wanted to focus our efforts on. That would include sidewalk upgrades, and in this package you should see a map of 7 different locations of potential sidewalk upgrades and costs associated with those. You can see the costs about $1.2 million for all of those. So we would also need to have, at some point, some discussion on which sidewalk sections we would like to focus on if that was one of the directions that we wanted to go. Bus shelters was another potential. I've included a typical bus shelter that MARTA provides these days. The bus shelter without the advertising is one that we would have to pay for. The bus shelter with the advertising is a shelter that MARTA would put up at our request and their cost outside of this grant. So the other issue or the other potential project on this list was the gateway signage and streetscapes. And of that project, it was one that was identified, but no specific location or signage or project was associated with that. If that was one we wanted to look at, we would have to go through that process to evaluate those. So I'm bringing these tonight just to get a little bit of feedback to see of the 3 projects remaining where we might want to focus. The $181,000. We also have the option of adding our own funding to that if we so chose. Nothing has specifically been budgeted in this particular year for that, but we do have that option available to us if we wanted to go beyond what we had left and do some more of the projects that were available. So I guess with that, any comments?
All right, so we're at a point right now, Carter, where we can do one project if it's, we've got some choices that are below the remaining budget, but we don't have, we couldn't do more than one unless we added additional funds.
That's probably
Or we
right.
could do a partial of something that's bigger than the remaining funds that we have.
Yes, sir. And if we looked at the sidewalk projects, the list of 7 that we had on there within the qualifying area,
Do a couple of those.
you could probably do a couple of them. Those estimated costs are in-house estimates, certainly not bid costs. I would think that if we were to bid that, we would probably bid 2 of the larger projects. Some of those just require more work. Some of the ones around the Deerfield area, all the drainage and curb and gutter is already in place. And some of the others, the Cogburn, Webb, there's really nothing out there. We would have to install curb, gutter, and drainage. The Cogburn and Webb pieces, particularly Webb Road on the other side of Highway 9, are both sections that don't have sidewalk on the other side of the street. All of the other sections have sidewalk on at least one side. They're just gaps on that particular side. So,
Go ahead.
Just when looking at those sidewalk projects, I'm just curious, how do those compare from a prioritization standpoint? If we were to look, say, at our transportation master plan, for a moment, if we set aside the cost, how would those compare? Obviously, the cost matters, but how would those compare in terms of prioritization, connecting neighborhoods, connectivity to the new high school? Would you prioritize those in the same order of 1 to 7?
coincidentally, I think they're probably in about the order I would prioritize them.
Okay.
I would be interested in seeing us concentrate on the sidewalk. Some form or fashion of these. 2 of them, or something that makes some sense. To finish, to get from A to B, not just to make A a little bit closer to B.
I'd agree. Let's get our most bang for the buck. Sidewalks,
Okay.
connections, whereas 2 or 3 smaller projects, but if that connects 2 or 3 areas versus 1, maybe
Yeah.
a smart way to do it.
Is there a time limit? I'm sorry. Is there a time limit where we have to spend this?
No, sir. Once we sign the agreement, we have 2 years to complete the project, but we have not signed an agreement so far on these funds. I think it's one of those that the faster you spend it, probably the more available the dollars are. You just never know. I mean, they shouldn't go anywhere. They're designated to the city of Milton, but I would prefer to get them under an official agreement as soon as we can.
Karen?
I would prefer to fill in the areas that we knew were not going to be filled in by somebody else, and if it was going to be developed, and also to fill in, I know that, I guess the paper had today about the McGinnis Ferry interchange, and it looks like there's a better chance that that interchange is going to be completed on 400. So I want to make sure we're not doing anything that would only have a life of 3 to 5 years. So my choice would be to spend it on areas where are already developed, where we can fill in and make sure that we have the connectivity that we need, and in areas where we're not going to be having to redo them in a short period of time.
Yes, ma'am.
Julie?
Thank you, Mayor. One other question. I know that when we first approved this, we had asked if we could use these funds for acquisition of parkland. We've obviously done that with at least $100,000, knowing that in concert with our master planning park initiative, that obviously identifying pocket parks throughout Milton is also a desire, and that would just be another place that this money could dovetail with some other master plans. So maybe in concert and looking at connectivity on sidewalks before we assume that there's not another pocket park, maybe in that same Highway 9 area that would be potential, especially because that would start to dovetail from a timeline perspective on our master plan. And I realize that we may or may not have one of those parcels identified, but I do know that 613 would allow for that, so just maybe an additional consideration.
So it would be under Deerfield and Highway 9.
Yeah, I know there's several properties that are being taken over by the bank around, Webb Road and stuff. If any of those become available at a really good price, it'd be a good pocket park that.
And this 181 could buy some land, which I think we'd all agree would be an ideal.
Bill?
Do we have an average unit cost for sidewalks, the range? And if so,
It's got the footage on there.
It varied depending on what improvements were necessary.
Sure.
The low end, those on Morris and Deerfield, where we had existing existing curb and gutter and drainage in place, those costs were relatively low. Once you got out to the Cogburn and Webb Road, where we were looking at maybe some significant grading, walls,
Right.
drainage, curb and gutter, we're probably up in the $135, $140 a foot on the sidewalk. Then you get out to McGinnis Ferry and Bethany Bend, where we've got some significant culvert extensions and pedestrian bridges over the creek that were necessary. That really increases those unit costs on the
sure,
sidewalk.
certainly.
So I think if you tried to take this list and go back and get a unit cost, it would vary from project to project, because we tried to look at them specifically and the needs on each project, rather than just doing a unit cost over each project. So.
Well, I was thinking a range out there, and I understand the difference in site conditions. But if you actually come up with, I guess, a total cost for filling in gaps around the MARTA area here, would 181,000 cover all of the missing sections of sidewalk?
Actually, this list fills in all the gaps, so it'll be 1.2 million.
Yeah, you'd have to pick either a couple small ones or.
We tried to
One
look at
large
everything. The service range was within a half mile of the MARTA bus route. So we tried to look at all those sidewalk sections where we had gaps within that half-mile area and fill those gaps.
Can you come back with something that kind of gives us the most, like I said before, most bang for our buck?
Yeah. I think what we
it
can
sounds
do.
like, besides parkland, also, it sounds like the council's pretty interested in sidewalk and spending some of this money on sidewalk. Is that, you don't agree?
And so I can do one of two things. I can come back probably to another work session with maybe a better list than this of priorities, and or I can just bring the agreements back with the top 2, maybe 3 projects where we think we can get as far as funding, and bring those agreements back for discussion.
Okay.
I could pull those off onto a regular agenda as opposed to a consent agenda so that we could talk about them, and if those were fine, we could go ahead and move forward with them. If they weren't, I can.
I'd rather do that. I'd rather go ahead and do it, and let's get them built.
Yeah,
Okay.
That sound right to everybody?
Yeah.
I'll take that direction then and bring the agreements back on a regular council agenda then.
Mayor, quick question.
Good, Julie.
Just based on the input in terms of parkland, as part of that, again, there may not be any parcels that are out there at the moment, but would it make sense, as Carter is looking at the sidewalks, to also at least evaluate whether or not there would be some pocket parkland that would be possible for those funds?
We can certainly look at the parcels that may be available.
Yeah.
The service area is relatively small, so it's
Right,
not.
it doesn't- right, it's a confined area, so.
Yeah, but let's take a look at it and let us know if that's an option.
Do that.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right. City Clerk, will please call the next item?
Next item is discussion on a cost of service study, presented by Chris Lagerblum.
I feel like I'm talking to the ceiling. So, all right, let me talk just a little bit about this agenda item tonight. And this is a discussion that I had wanted to have as a product of, about a month ago, Councilmember Tart made the recommendation that there was an agenda item tonight at this work session that talked about the city's finances, sustainability, cost of service, and all that good stuff. I spent the last month trying to figure out exactly what I could do to answer that question for you all with some type of fact-based data. I think I have an answer, and that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. And I think it's probably something we should consider doing, partly because it would be a relatively modest investment now to give us a long-range financial planning tool that could be used and modeled into the future as you all make and as Planning Commission makes decisions with respect to different types of development that would occur in Milton. It just so happens that we have in the state of Georgia 2 of the state's experts in doing cost of service type work for city and county governments. One is at Georgia Tech, the other at the University of Georgia. One is almost the protege of the other, and this is just what they do. I've had a good opportunity to speak to Dr. Jeff Dorfman a couple of times in the last month, as well as Dr. Alfie Meek, who's with Georgia Tech, and have kind of explained what it is I'd like to accomplish, and have asked them to kind of tell me where their expertise could give us a hand. And the difficulty with a sustainability discussion without a level of service discussion is that one is really not mutually exclusive of the other. Is there any question in my mind as to whether or not the city is very sustainable moving forward? Not a question at all. I think we've demonstrated that as a city we've made very, very positive steps in the last 5 years. The question now becomes whether or not you are satisfied with the level of service as it exists today, or whether that level of service needs to be modified and what that level of service might cost. I was around, as many of you were around, when the city kicked off 5 years ago, and the expectation and level of service was just do no worse than Fulton County. I think you all probably remember that in the very beginning was just make it better, just make it at least as good tomorrow as it was yesterday. And I don't think that expectation exists anymore today, nor do I think it should. I think that our city is definitely moving forward, and we need to continue to move forward in a positive manner. The decisions that you make will largely affect how that works. And, to the extent that I can give you a tool that is easier to use, more accurate, able to be used by you and by our staff on your computers and ours as you make decisions, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I'm going to do a little bit of reading here just because I think Dr. Dorfman captured in his own writing what he was and his group was capable of for the city of Milton. And rather than me trying to frame it in Chris E's, let me just read what Dr. Dorfman has indicated is something he could deliver here in Milton, as well as the fact that there's examples that he's delivered this in cities as close as Roswell, and they have used it quite extensively. Dr. Dorfman writes, as a new city, the city of Milton has a need for sound fiscal planning tool to assist it in making informed decisions as it plans its future land uses and makes development approval decisions. The city of Milton would benefit from knowing where it stands fiscally relative to different land uses, what impact new developments would have on the city budget, and what the future budgets might look like under different development scenarios. Having such information will help the government, service providers, and citizens understand the financial impact of the decisions they are making. Dr. Dorfman proposes to provide 3 services to the city of Milton. They don't all 3 have to be done. The one that is the base is the cost of service study, and the other 2 would be enhancements to that. The second is a fiscal impact model, and the third, which I think is quite intriguing, is a simulation of several growth scenarios and patterns for Milton over a 20-year horizon. A cost of service study provides a snapshot of the current city budget that separates revenues and expenditures by land use type. This provides the city with average information on the fiscal impact of residential development, commercial developments, and farmland. The cost of service study will also show the break-even home value for the city of Milton. The fiscal impact model will provide estimates of the fiscal impact of different developments on the city budget. The model will separately analyze the revenues and costs of projects by type, location, and density of development. Estimated revenues and cost allocations will be based on input from city staff along with expert analysis of government financial information. The model will provide estimates of the fiscal impacts of developments over time, as well as compute a net present value of the total lifetime impact. Decision-making groups will be able to include the fiscal impact of proposed land uses as part of their decision-making process. The model will be contained in an Excel spreadsheet that can easily be operated and updated by city staff as needed. The growth simulations will examine the fiscal sustainability of Milton over a 20-year planning horizon based on several plausible growth patterns. The different scenarios will vary the amount of land preserved in an undeveloped state and in density and location of the growth that does occur. And the different costs and tax rates that would result will be compared. Having said that, this is, I guess, one of the ways, if I'm going to try to, respond to the request that we had to have this discussion tonight, I wanted to do it with a potential manner in which we could move forward to answer with data and fact-based some of the questions that are being asked. I think this is one opportunity to do that. I think this would be a much more used tool than the one that we sort of had during the completion of the comprehensive plan, partly because that was so intensely computer formula driven in the back end that we had to, we were forced to be making assumptions to try to make it say what we thought it should say. There was something else I wanted to say that I've now forgotten what it was. But I think this might, this might be a good way to officially and formally answer some of the questions that are raised as to what does land use really do to revenues, expenditures, and how are those different projects impacted. What might be and what will come out of here, as he explained, is a very residential component to Milton is very sustainable, and this type of a study will help to point at what that break-even home value is, so that as you start to make decisions, the certain type of residential that you could feel comfortable moving forward with. I think the modest expense, and here I'll get to the punchline. If we were to do all 3 of these, we're talking a cost not to exceed $25,000. If we just did the cost of service study, which I think gets us the first step to where we want to be in answering that question, we're talking about a $10,000 study. And the amount of time that goes into this, as I've seen in other cities that Dr. Dorfman has worked in, the value is definitely there to answer some of those questions for Milton. So I throw that out to say that I wanted to make good on having at least a discussion at this work session that was requested. I wanted to have that discussion kind of with a solution in mind, so that if you say, Chris, what are we going to do to get the answer to the question, I wanted to come with that answer tonight as an option for you all to consider. If you have any feedback to me or feedback or questions of me, I'm happy to address those. Or if you want to just take this as general information and sleep on it and provide direction a week from now at the council meeting, I'm open to a discussion, and that's what work sessions are for.
I'll just say I talked to Chris about this, and I kind of like the idea of possibly moving forward on it, and the tool that we would have moving forward, and, as things start to change around here, or if they do change, we can plug and play and kind of see where we are. So, Karen?
Just a couple things. I very much support it. I think we need this information as we're making decisions. What kind of format? I know you said Excel spreadsheet. Would he be giving us some kind of documents with these things, or what would our deliverable be? And also, I believe that will he be doing some kind of presentation to us on how it all works? And if so, I think the Planning Commission needs to be there.
Let me answer the first part of your question, which is what's the deliverable look like? I have examples of what it looks like. I just didn't print them out tonight. He did send examples from some of his other work. It's very user-friendly, very usable. It takes an Excel spreadsheet, makes even somebody like me able to understand what it's saying. And that doesn't mean that the back-end formulas I could understand, but I can understand what's on the screen and what I need to know from it. Yes, and any of these expenses all expenses are included, as are presentations to the City Council, any desired community group, or other planning type group for the City of Milton. So within this is presentations to you all, to the Planning Commission. That was what I meant to bring up, is I did reach out. I didn't want to bring an item like this forward to a public meeting without at least having reached out to the chair of the Planning Commission. He was out of town and couldn't obviously speak on behalf of the Planning Commission when I talked to him, but I wanted to run past him whether or not he felt as though this would be usable to his group as they make decisions or as they evaluate cases that come before them. And he felt very strongly, without speaking on behalf of his commission, or because he couldn't, but he felt very strongly that this was a very useful tool in making future land use decisions.
And this tool would not be telling us what direction we need to go or what decisions we need to make. It's just a tool for us to use for when we need to make those decisions.
It's going to give you answers to questions you frequently answer that here to date we've been able to answer to some degree, not to the level, though, that I think if we were to go down this road that I think we'd be able to answer your questions as we come out of this non-building time, as we start to get back into an economy that's stronger. I think these questions are going to come more frequently. That's why I'm almost thinking now is the right time to get ahead of this. It's also important that now is a good time because we just closed out a fiscal year and we have actually very real and very valid numbers that are timely.
And it would be able to answer very specific things, such as on the property right south of here that is, I believe, was originally zoned for commercial up to 4-story, 6-story building. If somebody came in and wanted to put townhomes there instead of that kind of building, what impact that would have to the city?
That is correct.
Because I think that's something that's important for us to understand. So,
That's correct.
Sure.
Chris, and just as this unfolds, I guess in addition to having presentations from, is it Dr. Dorfman?
Yes.
What do you anticipate the process to be, just as he's developing that model? And I think what we've all discovered through the last process is that a model is only as good and it's only as valid as the assumptions going into that model. Obviously, it's, I think, probably fair to assume that staff would be working with Dr. Dorfman, but before that becomes a finalized model, what are the steps? And I think I heard you said that he'd come and present to staff and to the Planning Commission, but is that a relatively fluid process whereby, as that model is evolving, that folks are evaluating what those assumptions are? Because, again, the assumptions are what will either allow that to be something that people consider valid or not.
I think it's reasonably fluid to the extent that we'll provide the data that ultimately results in the answers coming out of this study. Although to the extent that if it's just us providing numbers into an Excel spreadsheet that's all of a sudden going to spit out an answer, we don't need a Dr. Dorfman putting his name behind it. I mean, there's many of these things that over the course of more than 2 decades of doctoral work that Dr. Dorfman has done in counties and cities across the state and region and nation, there's some things he's learned as a product of doing that we're not, those aren't assumptions that I think that we probably will drive. I mean, I think the things that we will provide are the data that we have in the form of budget numbers versus revenues received in residential, expenditures from service that go to residential. It's pretty easy to at a very high level. We can say what kind of residential tax base is received versus what portion of the police time, for example, is used in responding to false alarms in residential neighborhoods. And, so you start to put enough of those layers together. That's the information I think we're going to provide. I think to the extent that we've got somebody of his caliber, I don't know that we're going to guide his assumptions.
And that wasn't the question. I'll be more clear. Maybe in the deliverable, I guess the question is, what level of description is he giving to those assumptions that are kind of core assumptions? And so I'm assuming that as part of that deliverable, before it's an end product, that and maybe it's something that's as current as what you mentioned that he's worked on for Roswell, if there's something that's current. Because obviously those assumptions change depending on the economic cycles that we're in, et cetera. And so it's probably maybe a subset of the question of what is the deliverable. But it seems to me that as that's being developed, because it's probably more than just a plug and play, and maybe he's already provided that to you, but what are some of those data points that he's incorporating as part of his research, as part of his position?
I think where you might be going here is if we were to talk about the simulation of the several development growth scenarios. I think that's maybe where it's more fluid to the extent that we say, we want to look at this development model, we want to look at this development model, this one, and this one, and we define the development models we want to look at.
Or even maybe just, how does he assess the cost of commercial versus the cost of residential? So it's understanding those assumptions even before you get to that model. So I guess maybe a way of summarizing that is just to say whatever assumptions he's driving as part of his model, I'll assume that would be defined, it would be easily understandable by those evaluating that model and how it comes together. In other words, there's no mystery around the black box.
If we choose to move forward with this, one of the things I can ask for, and he seems accommodating enough of a guy so far in my interactions with him, I'll ask him to come to a work session maybe on the outset of his, and then maybe I'll ask him to come pre and post. Right now he said I'll come post. He'd be one of those guys that would come in February or March and chat with us.
Yeah, and I can't believe that those would be hidden and not adjustable because Milton is different from any other city in Georgia, and if he's doing this in other places, it's got to be somewhat configurable. So
let me understand this then. The first phase, he's going to take the data that we give him and come up with a couple different.
The first phase is to do the cost of service study, where basically we take the data that we have and figure out what residential costs us to serve, what commercial costs us to serve, what farmland costs us to serve, where those revenue streams come from, where those expenditures are going, and that independently could stand on its own. Okay, so we could be done there. Doing a fiscal impact model or some of these development models or scenarios are things that could happen only after step one happens, but we could do 1 and 3, we could do 1 and 2, we could do 1, 2, and 3. Got to do 1, and then we'll decide if. Very honestly, the one that's intriguing to me are these 20-year development models. I mean, 20-year horizon with development models. Now that answers real questions, and I think and here's nobody's can get a crystal ball out and actually answer this question, but I would venture to say that the investment that we would make into this type of model at this point, there will be a short return on our investment to the city of Milton. I would see the decisions we would make, if they're smarter decisions, return a $25,000 investment pretty darn quick.
Well, I see the value in it. I guess my question is, in the second and third phase, we're going to have this software available to us. Is that correct? We're buying this software?
That's right.
So what's to preclude us from buying whatever software we need up front and doing the actual data input ourselves?
Because I don't know that I have anybody on our staff that has 2 decades of educational background into making it some of these statements that will likely come that we can rely upon as being valid.
Okay, so he's going to take the output from this program after inputting all this data and writing up a report, I guess, based on his experience in what the data really means or what the output really means.
That's right.
And I assume when you say cost of service, he's not going to just look at service as we are currently providing it, but look at service that is typically provided, or especially when it relates to parks, because, I mean, the service we're providing right now related to parks is not what I believe most of our residents really want.
There will be benchmarks, yes.
Okay.
I think answers your question.
You know, again, I'll say, like I said earlier, I would certainly support looking into this further. What's the rest of the council think?
I'm definitely in favor of it.
Good, you guys? Okay, so
All right, thank you.
take that next step.
Yes, sir.
So will that be something that'll be before us then in January, or is that?
I know it won't be before you next Monday, and it's questionable as to whether or not it'll be before you on the 9th, but I would think by the second meeting in January.
Okay.
Okay. City Clerk, please call the next item.
Next item is discussion on an ordinance to amend Chapter 42, Secondhand Goods, by adding in Article 3, Precious Metals Dealers. Presented by Ken Gerard.
Mr. Mayor and members of the council, might I recommend that we treat numbers 4 and 5 together because they are closely affiliated and quite frankly are very much sort of the same scheme. So if that's okay, I'll just sort of discuss both. I had prepared a little bit of an outline for the council and had circulated it to you on Thursday, and I'm not going to deviate a whole lot from that. I mean, these are, let me say at the outset that these are sort of thick regulatory schemes that we're setting up here, and I think that Milton is doing itself a favor by being a little bit ahead of the ball. And the reality is we don't have many of these institutions in Milton, if any, at this point, and so it's kind of nice to have our regulations in place before we're trying to catch up and regulate what's already here. You take care of sort of vexing grandfather investing issues if you already have your construct in place.
So do we have copies of that? I mean, we've got copies of the ordinances. Do we have copies of your outlines here in our packet?
We may, because David was kind enough to. Could you print up some more? Yes.
That would be helpful.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
I brought mine since you said for us to print it out and bring it.
Well, I wasn't going to say that out loud. But no, that's fine. I should.
Well, I
quite
read it,
frankly,
but I
should
prefer not to read it on my phone. It's a very small print.
I'm sure that didn't lend itself to good phone
Yeah.
reading, quite frankly. While he's preparing those, I'll just get through some of these preliminary remarks. Basically, the schemes are sort of the same for both pawnbroker and precious metal. You're both driving at the same public policy objective, and that is to set forth a regulatory construct to try and make sure that to the extent these institutions do locate in Milton, that they are not institutions that will foster and augment criminal activity. That's the overriding objective, and you do that by way of basically a permitted and licensure scheme. That's number one, not only for the establishments themselves, but also for those employees who work there. It's sort of a bifurcated dual licensing system. You do it with interaction with the police chief, who will have some of the processing and application controls. You do it with a series of regulations about what you can in fact pawn, what you can in fact bring in as a precious metal that can be used to conduct a transaction with one of these vendors. But the primary nuts and bolts is the record keeping. And that is things like fingerprinting the individuals that bring one of these items in for a transaction, a clear, good quality color photograph of the individual committing the pawn transaction or committing the precious goods transaction. The retention of the product for a certain period of time. We put in this draft, we put in 45 days for everything, and I understand that may be the subject of more discussion, and that's fine. But irrespective of what the number is, the public policy rationale behind it is that the items need to be delayed such that law enforcement has a record of them and such that individuals that have these items taken from them have a chance to catch up, if you will, and see if they can secure the items back if they have in fact been stolen. I will tell you that in one other jurisdiction, when we were dealing with this particular sort of ordinance, some of the citizens that spoke, and this was in Forsyth County, I'll just tell you, there is a lot of lake residential property up there that is only really housed during the summer. And so if there's theft, they don't know about it until maybe they come back, they may be absentee property owners. And 30 days was not enough, which was the argument for them, because by the time I come back and check on my property again and find out something's been stolen, it's been 60 days or 90 days, and by the time I fill out my reports and begin the process, that stuff's already gone. So I'm not going to suggest to you there's a perfect number for how long we keep it, and you all are faced with the difficult chance of making the number long enough to allow law enforcement and the public to feel comfortable that it's a reasonable retention period, but also you don't want to necessarily drive these businesses to where they can't function. And that's going to be the other sort of shoe to drop on this. All right, with those, have we got the...
I sent them to another printer to keep the volume down.
All right. Well, what I'll do is I'll just go slow, and then I'll begin to pick up speed as we have it. Let's just start with pawn shops and brokers. That's the one that is first in the email I had sent you. The public policy objective is to curtail criminal activity, and again, you hate to say that, and you hate to identify one particular business, and I'm not attempting to defame a particular business or businesses, but the reality is that those businesses are sometimes, whether knowingly or not knowingly, used for that sort of transaction, and so there is a legitimate public safety rationale for why we can enact ordinances in this area. You know, when the city manager was talking to you about changing your charter and what we could regulate, and he sort of had to fall back on the notion that just because a particular business is not set forth in your charter, we always, as a government authority, have the ability to regulate for the public health, safety, and welfare, and that's what you're doing here. The first, sort of the way this one is structured, is that we will require persons employed by a pawn shop business to have a pawn shop employee permit, which would be a $50 renewed annually permit. The criteria for receipt of such a permit are set forth in the code. And I'm not going to walk you through those, but just understand that these are the sort of thing where individuals are going to have to provide background checks, driver's license, a lot of personal information. And the trick is, and the objective is to make you have to come very, very, very clean with Milton as far as who you're employing, and we have to have the ability to know the sort of caliber of individual that you're hiring to work in your operation. We all know that all of the good intentions notwithstanding, if your employees are not trustworthy or less than credible or are nefarious and willing to engage in criminal activity, then criminal activity will occur. And that's what we're trying to prevent against. The pawn shop ordinance in the middle of page 1 in your email is the nuts and bolts, though. An application for a pawn shop license in Milton would require 3 character references. Now, the plat certifying the 5,000-foot distance between certain other sorts of establishments like schools, parks, residential uses, libraries, and churches, you probably remember language like that in the alcohol code. However, this will teach me to set forth distance requirements without checking with your GIS department first. This will effectively work as a carte blanche prohibition against the location of any of these in the city of Milton. So,
as well as a couple of places in Alfred and Roswell for site
well,
Cherokee County.
it may very well work as a prohibition against anything in Kentucky. So what we're probably going to have to do is get with GIS and come back to you with some distance setback requirements that do not work as a carte blanche prohibition. That is not the intention of this. It's the intention of it to make sure that we do not have sort of like billboard setbacks, sort of like alcohol setbacks. There's a reason no jurisdiction wants to be known as the place where you've got pawn shops or billboards or various other things that are sometimes are considered to have less than a positive reflection on the community. So we will come back to you next week with a distance calculation that is more reasonable than 5,000 feet. The city, upon receiving an application, has 45 days to review it. That review will primarily take place by the police chief as well as your finance director. The council will ultimately be called upon to approve or deny the application. Moving on to page 2. You also have powers with respect to suspend, revoke, or place some of these businesses on probation based upon false information in the application, deceptive business practices, violations of city ordinances, commission of a felony by members of the pawn shop business, or, and this is important, failure to maintain necessary record-keeping in books. A license number for the license permit shall be maintained in the window of the establishment. The records to be maintained, this is absolutely critical. With respect to pawn shop businesses, we want records of all property pledged, traded, pawned, or exchanged, to include manufacturer, model, serial number, style, material, kind, color, design, number of stones of jewelry, and identifying marks. There is going to be a tag placed upon the pawned material that will remain with the item until sold. A proper identification must be secured by the person tendering the item for pawn, to include address, telephone number, race, sex, height, weight, driver's license, date of birth, social security number of the person submitting the pawned item, a digital photograph, fingerprints. No new items unless receipt is provided. In other words, you can't come in and pawn a newly purchased in the shrink wrap until there is a receipt identifying that. Obviously, we don't want people to shoplift and then go and pawn it. Just to be as candid with you as I can. The store shall retain those digital photographs and fingerprints for 4 years. That is a lengthy retention schedule. We will also have to, if this ordinance in its present form is to be adopted, we will have to set up with the work and help of the police chief and, quite frankly, with the city manager as well, because this will likely involve the retention of a contract with a third-party vendor. We will have to have prepared some sort of an electronic reporting system. The objective of the ordinance is that these pawn shops will make literally electronic reporting to the police chief of items pawned. It may very well be, and I think that you could see over the years in the state of Georgia, as jurisdictions become more sophisticated, I believe that you may see a statewide system of electronic databases maintained that will contain items of pawned material. But it starts locally, and we may be a little bit on the forefront of this, but the idea would be that there would be a basically a central database maintained by the city of Milton for all pawned items in Milton, and that could be shared with both local, state, and even federal law enforcement, if need be. Daily reporting requirements, I'm on the bottom third of page 2. All pawnbrokers will make a daily report in the form as required by the police chief for the previous 24-hour period. We'll specify the pawned or items that were pawned. Paper forms may be used if the electronic automated reporting system is down. And a fee shall accompany each reported transaction. This would be a de minimis fee simply meant to capture the cost of the report. Go ahead.
You mentioned third-party monitoring of this. Are there currently third parties?
You know, I don't know. The jurisdictions that I work in aren't quite this sophisticated. I have not seen this electronic system used. And I think the ordinance is good enough where if we don't have it set up, they don't have to use it, but it might be something we could at least price and see what it would cost to do that. I can't help but believe that somewhere there is this sort of a thing out there that would be used. Chris, do you have more on that?
Yeah, we have it already.
We have it already?
We do.
We have
a software that is capable of doing that, but it has other benefits to us, but we don't have to go out and find that.
Councilmember Lutz, the answer is yes. We have this, in fact.
I guess the question, regardless if it's third party or you handle it in-house, that's going to require some additional labor on public safety department.
That's right. Yeah, we want to be mindful of the fact that this does not come without at least some human interaction with this software system. So you're right, there is. And that magnitude is in direct magnitude to the number of these locations we have and the number of pawn tickets coming through.
And of course, the other shoe to drop is the fact that it will have to be implemented at the actual establishments themselves. They'll have to have some sort of a terminal that they can then interface with what we have here and input that data, and that will carry with it some firewall requirements and things of that nature. So that sort of interaction too.
Just to close the loop, it's the software that we have is subscription based, and it's $2,100 a year. I think so. It's worth $2,100 a year to subscribe to it, even for the benefit we get now from it, without having any pawn shops of our own.
And just a quick point, Chris, to your, when you were talking about labor, it might be important for everybody to remember that the state law requires, if you start to have pawn shops, the state requires certain reporting and certain requirements of the police. So a lot of this is effectively required as soon as you have a pawn shop. So you can't avoid the state law, in other words.
The pawn goods, in at least the draft in front of you, will be retained for 45 days before they could be sold. We have a prohibition against the pawning of glass from buildings, art, copper wire, copper linings of bathtubs, lead pipes, etc. I'm sure the reason for that prohibition is self-evident. Hours of operation would be 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Monday through Thursday, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. on Friday and Saturday, and closed Sundays. And pawn shop owners and employees would have a duty to report to Milton transactions where they reasonably believe the goods to have been stolen, not the least of which would be situations where, for instance, serial numbers on products have been manipulated or filed off, things where there's an obvious indication that someone's attempting to hide the origin of the product, things of that nature. Yes, sir.
Are we trying just to prevent pawnbrokers from coming into the area? I mean, is that, because according to this, it looks like we're telling them that, you know, we're making it so that it's clearly not worth their time and money to come to Milton, and they're just going to go somewhere else. So if that's what we're going to do, then that's fine, but...
Well, I will concede the 5,000-foot setback we're going to rework to make sure that doesn't act as a carte blanche prohibition against them. So, but no, that's not the intent. The intent is not to run those off. In fact, that's why we need to revisit that language and make it a lot more...
I mean, because I'll be honest with you, I've got some yellow gold that I've had for 20 years that I don't ever wear because I don't ever wear yellow gold. But if I was going to take it to be sold, I wouldn't go somewhere that you had to go through all of this. I'd go right across another, 100 feet away and go to Alpharetta, Forsyth, somewhere else and sell it just because it's easier.
But those places require the same. You have to
Well,
take
that's what
a
I was
picture
going
of the
to say.
fingerprint.
Kind of cutting to the chase. I mean, I think unless, if we're more restrictive than our neighborhood, then we're effectively just eliminating pawn shops because, people aren't going to go to them. They're not going to open up if they're here. So we kind of need to decide: are we, in effect, trying to limit pawn shops from here? Or,
So the criminals go to the next city over to...
So I guess my point, I think it's great that we get more restrictive, but I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors because if someone steals something in Milton, they're not going to go to a Milton pawn shop. If there ever were a Milton pawn shop, they're going to go, far out. They're smart, so.
I've said through public hearings before where representatives of the pawn shop is, I guess, lobby have come up and have poked, holes and concerns with respect to ordinances, and they make the same arguments that you're making. They're saying, look, we'll just go to other locations where the requirements are not so onerous, and quite frankly, I'm not going to be able to compete in your jurisdiction because of the regs that you set up. It's not the intention. That's not the intention, but this is a rigorous ordinance.
And then it makes it even harder for someone who has a theft in Milton to find their stuff because they haven't gone somewhere close by. They've gone further away where the rules are easier. So there's less likely of you actually recovering your stuff.
Are these model codes?
No, these are not model codes.
I think it would be helpful for folks that may not have looked as closely at some of the other jurisdictions' ordinances. Many of these things are required either by the state law and or by those jurisdictions. So it's not as though these things are not required. If you go into a pawn shop in Roswell or Alpharetta, you do have to have your fingerprints taken. You have to have a photograph taken. They have to hold the items.
But they don't hold them 45 days.
I think that's
it varies.
The times are different.
I agree with that.
And 45 days to hire an employee. I mean, you have somebody quit or get sick. What do you do if you can't hire somebody else for 45 days? I mean, that makes it tough to run a business.
Kim, maybe it would be helpful if things that you think are more onerous, to highlight those. I'll just say that personally, I do think it's important that we have a way and a mechanism to have an ordinance in place. And obviously, to Ken's point, when he put in 5,000 square feet, he wasn't thinking about the GIS impact of that. But to have nothing to be ahead of that curve before a pawn shop or a entity that does promote criminal activity would be to say, that we would want that criminal activity to be here. I don't think anybody would want that to be the case.
Okay, so Julie, on that question, I think that's a real important question. I mean, you're talking about there are certain state requirements that we can't escape.
Yes.
And so the real question is, we don't have to, part of this we don't have to worry about because there's already state regulations that are in effect, and Milton can't do away with them. That we have to support them. Okay, so what we're talking about here is augmenting what exists at a state level. Is that correct?
I mean, as an example, clarifying that the photographs are actually clear, because a lot of times you'll get a pawn shop that will submit something to the police, and it's, you know, it's a copy, it's black. I mean, the police chief can't even tell what it is. And so again, part of this is to help our own police department to be able to identify the criminals, and because as we're seeing in a lot of adjacent jurisdictions right now, we've had increased numbers of home invasions. The DA today was making some statements to the paper and is very concerned, and obviously is looking to Milton and some of the other jurisdictions to put some things in place so that our police forces across jurisdictions actually have something to work with. And I think that's the other point of this that's so important is that, let's just say that Chief Harrell and her police officers are looking for something. It is the need to have that sort of communication across jurisdictions. I know that that's where the DA's office is heading for all of Fulton County, but to Ken's point, looking across the state, because it's not just about recovering the item, it's also about making sure that we get the bad guys off the streets, or I shouldn't say guys, bad guys and women that may be involved. But the timetable, the state is an example, and as Ken mentioned, when you have someone whose items are stolen, you know, a 7-day or 15-day and a 30-day, I mean, as Forsyth folks were saying that oftentimes 30 days is not enough. Some jurisdictions go to the point of 60 days, which, you know, some places may feel is too onerous. But the point being, because it is so labor intensive to be looking for the folks that obviously our police are out arresting, is that if you don't have that mechanism or the timetable that allows jurisdictions to cross-reference information, unfortunately, the folks don't ever have that opportunity to recover their information. So some of the state requirements, like the time that they hold it, most jurisdictions go beyond that, because 7 days, half the people don't even know that they've been robbed within the first 7 days. And then all the items can ultimately then be melted down, and then you can't recover it.
I think that, you know, the real answer is to have the state, you know, change the rules and have everybody on the same playing field. You know, I still go back to, I don't have a problem with any of this, but I think what we're doing is just effectively saying no pawn shops in the city of Milton. So I don't know if that's our real intent here or not. You know, until we get close to what Alpharetta, Roswell, our neighbors are doing, and it may be 30 days instead of 45. I think
Where
one
do
of
you
them's
think,
30.
Ken, is some of that difference? I mean,
Well,
I think we need to know how this compares to the jurisdictions around us, including Forsyth County, Cherokee County, and the cities in Fulton County.
I think Chris is
anticipating that question tonight.
I think that's part of what Paul Fricky did.
I did look at Alpharetta, Roswell, Johns Creek, Sandy Springs, Forsyth County, and Cherokee County. And to give you some idea, Alpharetta, Roswell, and Johns Creek, by virtue of the fact that Johns Creek's ordinance appears as though they continue to just rely upon the state's regulation and not regulated in their further in their code, are at 10 days. Sandy Springs is at 15 days. Cherokee County and Forsyth County are both at 30 days.
But do any of them make you get an employee permit 45 days before you hire somebody? I mean, to me, that's just...
The thing I did the comparison...
That's so anti-business that it's...
The thing I did the comparison on was the amount of time that was required, because the state regulated the amount of time things had to be held.
Right.
That was what I did the comparison on, is to see how the cities were different than maybe what the state required. I did not do any type of comparison.
Unless I'm reading this wrong, that 45-day thing is for the pawn shop license, not the employee.
No, this was an employee too.
And that was a Ken thing, so
Yeah.
just ask Ken. what
Do
he
that.
thought.
Yeah, no, it says here that, you know, city shall have 45 days to investigate the information submitted by the employee.
Well, how long does it normally, like with an alcohol? I mean, Ken, you obviously put that language in there. Where did the 45 days come from?
Well, again, the ceiling's not the floor. I mean, that's how long we have to be able to process it. But obviously, if the city of Milton acts quicker than that, we could certainly do that.
How long does it take to process, as an example? Because I think a similar sort of situations like with alcohol licensing, because you
And it
have the
can-
potential for criminal or
I mean, it can take,
behavior.
a week or less. It can take that long, and if we wanted to lower that, that's fine. I just didn't want to be in a situation where it takes longer than that. There's some extraordinary, unusual situation, and, we have blown right past our deadline, so.
What is it for alcohol licensing? I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand up.
How long do we have to process them?
Because to me, it would,
I don't know that it speaks to a timeline. We do
timeline.
them within a couple days. I mean,
Yeah.
It's almost a
Yeah.
next day type turnaround.
Ken, I think the important thing that you've told us so far is, the idea behind adopting an ordinance to cover this is to make sure we don't get into some kind of strange grandfather clause situation with businesses that set up when we don't have an ordinance. And we obviously don't have any pawn shops or precious metal dealers in the city limits today.
Yeah.
So is there a way for us to adopt because, we can sit here and debate for 8 hours what goes into this ordinance, and we haven't accomplished anything because there's no businesses that are going to have to, abide by this. But in anticipation of somebody opening up, is there a way for us to adopt an ordinance that can be changed over time such that we don't create any grandfather clauses, that the businesses that set up in Milton have to abide by the ordinance whether or not we change it? And how often we change it, it wouldn't matter.
Yes, there is, and look, don't get too concerned about that, because the reality is the way these are set up too, just like your alcohol code, is they're annual licenses and they expire at the end of every year, and then you renew them. So every time you renew, my position is, and I think it's supported in the law, that you sort of have to come into compliance. So I'm not terribly worried about grandfathering or vesting. It's mainly that mid-year uncertainty as to what rules apply. Here, you're sort of dealing with a blank slate. You've got none of these businesses in
Right.
Milton right now, so it's a nice time
Right.
to
Well,
do it and get ahead of it.
I guess my point was going to be, and I was anticipating that answer, that it was, at the renewal point of their license, they have to sign up to following the new rules.
Yes, sir.
Why can't we just put the boilerplate state language in our ordinance and revisit this at the point in time we actually get a business show up in Milton that wants to be a pawn shop or wants to be a precious metal dealer?
You could. I mean, the reason we're having this work session discussion is, other than my bullet points in my email, we've not had a protracted discussion with you actually having a document in front of you, and now that you do, and I certainly sense some concern by the council, we can modify it if you need to. That's no problem at all. I just felt it was only fair that you have something in front of you.
No, yeah, absolutely, and I appreciate the
And
effort that went into this.
Those renewals, those permits would be calendar years, so you wouldn't have somebody renewing a year after, where you have all that. It would be-
Very similar to your alcohol scale.
thank you, Mayor. I'll just say that I think that the boilerplate at the state level, Joe, it doesn't go far enough. I mean, the boilerplate has either 10 or 7 days for a holding period, and it's not enough. I mean, having been through a similar process and looked at a lot of these jurisdictions, and again, Ken took the liberty with this to put some things in there that obviously none of us have seen before, getting this in advance of this evening. So to Karen's point, the 45 days for an employee, that can easily be modified. I feel strongly that a 7 to 10 day holding period is absolutely not adequate. Do we want to be business friendly? Of course we do. Do we necessarily want to be so business friendly that we want to attract pawn businesses that are not willing to abide by some level of adherence to protect against thievery? I would hope that we want to attract business, but we want to attract the business that's willing to not partake in criminal activity. And the reality right now, I mean, truly, the DA's office in Fulton County, I mean, as of today, is increasingly concerned about pawn and broker and the gem buying, because it's becoming the new fence. And I think what we don't want to do is to have Milton become the place that the criminals say, gee, let's go do some more crime in Milton, because we've got a pawn shop right here that we know is going to take stuff. They only have to hold it 7 days. Because the reality is that there is not a database in place right now where you can have a sharing of data. So the reality, you talk to the police and you look at what's out there, is that by having only the boilerplate, it does promote more criminal activity.
Yeah, and I guess my point is, we've had nothing up to this point other than whatever exists at the state level.
Right.
And we haven't become a mecca for these businesses. And I would agree, we don't want to become a mecca for these businesses. But to spend a lot of time trying to figure out, should it be 45 days, should it be 60 days, should it be 5,000 feet, should it be 1,000 feet, I don't know that it's a good use of our time if we've got no business to regulate.
Can I make a suggestion, maybe, in listening to both sides here? You know, how tough would it be to take a look at what our surrounding neighbors are doing, possibly make ours just a smidge tougher so that, we're not just relying on the state. And then, as we talked before, we can always change it, the next year if we do ever have a pawn shop apply, but at least go ahead and have something that's at least as stringent or maybe a little bit more stringent than our surrounding cities here, but not so far off that it just totally eliminates everything, gets us in a bind that way.
Let me offer 2 points. First of all, to Councilmember Longoria's point, I do want it for interest to full disclosure. If you went in the Milton Code and looked up pawn shop or pawnbroker, you would find a very small section on that. So I just don't want you to think that it's not even mentioned. It is, but it's typically the state law that's identified. Secondly, Mr. Mayor, I mean, certainly we could do that. I mean, I think when you get to it and pull some of the other jurisdictions in, I think you're going to find a lot of similarities, except when you get into the issue of the length of time to hold. To Councilmember Thurman's point, the 45 days is a bit. It's a long time. And so, I guess my point is you're going to see a lot of similarities, and then a couple of things are going to really jump out at you that are strikingly different. I guess what I need, though, is some direction for next Monday as we have the next or second presentation with respect to this. We've got a code that's been advertised. We've got an ordinance that's been advertised, and I've got some comments by Chief Harold that I think I need to implement into it and insert into it, but I'm not sure this is where the council wants to go or in this format, so I just need some guidance.
How hard would it be to come up with the similarities, but not the items that are strikingly different?
Let me see if I can answer that one. I don't think that's hard, and honestly, I think we're far enough down this road. If you were going to ask, what's Chris's recommendation? I think we need to. What's Chris's recommendation? I think we put enough work into this. We need to go ahead and close this door. It is worth regulating these two industries. Having a prior law enforcement background, this is worth doing. Now, it's a completely up for debate as to what's the right number, 30 or 45 or 15 or 10. But we've spent a lot of time and energy getting to where we are today. If we can figure out if those numbers, as you indicated, might be, get us comparable in the area, maybe a schmid, whatever that word was, smidge, tougher. I don't know that it's worth at this point abandoning all this effort and just saying, well, let's wait. In all due respect to the fact that we don't have these yet, this is okay to get in front of. I do believe that these are two businesses that are okay to get in front of.
I think
and let's go ahead
and I'll clarify too. The only reason I'm saying just a smidge more, because if we are so much further out than everybody else, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because anybody that criminals that take something in Milton, they're going to go somewhere else versus. If we're within range, the possibility it may go to Milton and we may be able to catch it.
Well, the beauty of where you're positioned is, to Chris's point, is that if you send me out of here and our instruction is to go and basically look at these other jurisdictions and sort of rein in some of the components to be more in line with what they are at, I don't think we need to re-advertise, because the ordinance is not becoming more tough. It's becoming it's becoming less regulation is the bottom line, and I think that does not require another public hearing. So we could do that for next week.
And I'd like to see too, if you did another one of these outlines or something, if you could somehow indicate what's on the state laws that's not worth us debating. So we know, blah blah blah. We don't even need to talk about.
We need to know what the state minimum is,
Yeah.
what the adjacent cities are, and then what we're looking at.
And then just something reasonable that gets in there.
I can do that.
And may I?
Yes.
Sorry. I think what I've heard is that, to Karen's point, 45 days for employees is too long. obviously, can pull back. So I don't know what the right time frame is. I think that's more a function of what staff feels that they can, from a processing standpoint, handle.
I think that'll be something that's worded as soon as practical, but shall not exceed.
Yeah, that's an easy fix.
And that addresses the point that Councilmember Thurman made. In terms of the square footage, obviously Ken just pulled that because probably it's similar to the, I guess,
The
you
linear
pulled it
footage,
because
maybe.
of billboards.
It made sense in Kansas.
Montana made it, Wyoming.
But that square footage could change, and I think to Chris's point, this is
Straight line distance between locations. I just want to make sure
I think that's what you had included, is the linear foot. So
Lineal
it-
feet, not square feet.
So it needs to be obviously less. But I do think that some sort of distance requirement is important because what you don't want to have is, a strip of pawn shop after pawn shop because if you look at the statistics, it does increase the amount of crime in close proximity to the pawn shops because somebody that's stealing, they want to steal and they want to immediately get it to a pawn shop and get rid of it. And so it does bring more, if you look at the statistics, it does bring more crime close to the location of the pawn shop. And then I would just ask for consideration, for you guys to please consider at least a 30-day holding period. Having been through this process, the reality is that if you don't have at least 30 days, you will never recover anything because between the police activity and between just the sheer volume of places that something could be, and because there's not a centralized database, the criminal activities within these businesses are counting on a short window so that people never find it and they basically take ownership of it and say, you know what, I'm sorry, we've already melted it down. And so it's really intended, to Chris's point, these businesses are worthy of some level of regulation because they drive crime. And so we very much want to be a city that's business friendly, but I don't think we want to be business friendly to the criminal. And if we don't have some regulation that I believe firmly with a holding period of at least 30 days, and Paul Fricke, granted they may not be immediately adjacent, but Rome and Snellville, Douglasville, there's a lot of communities in Georgia that have at least a 30-day window.
I believe it's Forsyth County, right? Cherokee County.
Yeah, so
I mean,
they're really-
so that's not out of the question.
Yeah, so, if people can't stomach 45, I would just ask you to please consider at least 30 if our intent is to help protect our citizens, because it is a balance. Yeah, you want to be business friendly, but we don't want to be business friendly to the extent that we drive more criminal activity in Milton.
Yeah, and I just hate, painting with a broad brush.
Yeah.
That pawn and metal places are just criminal hubs.
And they're not all. But the reality, if you look at this, and Chris, maybe you can speak to it, or Chief Harrell, is that that's where the...
Well, I understand there's a correlation.
There's a correlation. and
I just don't know.
I do think we have to acknowledge
Yeah.
that the correlation exists, because it does.
My point to actually fix the problem is we're going to have to get everybody to be on the same page with a 30-day or
Absolutely.
45-day or whatever.
And I will say, I think Paul
So-
Howard is hoping to see more of that movement. I think that there's a lot of desire from the criminal justice area to help move that, not only in Fulton County, but across the state. Very much like with the pill mills, is that there's some things that are just necessary.
Do you guys,
let me tell you what I've kind of leaned over and talked to Ken that I'd like to look at between now and Monday. I do think it is reasonable that we would look at some distance requirement between two similar facilities, meaning that there's a distance between, let's say 5,000 feet distance between two pawn shops. So what I've written down on paper that I'd like to at least look at in GIS tomorrow is 5,000 feet between two pawn shops, and I'd like to see what 1,000 feet from residential looks like on a map and see what that leaves us. So that might be worth taking a look at.
Bless you.
What's the idea with that distance? I understand the distance between two adjacent businesses, but what's the issue with? I mean, we can't keep a gas station from going in 75 feet next to a residential, piece of land. So what's the idea with the pawn shop?
Just as a manner in which to keep it away from residential. But if you want one in somebody's backyard, I can.
No, I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm saying. But again, we're getting to this point where we're disabling the business itself.
I mean, we're assuming all of them are criminals.
Either we want to have them or we don't. If we don't want to have them, let's just say that it can't exist. Okay, Sorry.
I know a rhetorical question when I hear one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right.
So let me look at this tomorrow. Let me look at something that might represent 5,000 feet, no distance of 5,000 feet between them. I'll look at a couple of other models, and I'll keep them to myself, depending on what the results are, or I'll share them if I think they warrant being shared. And I'd also look at, I don't think it's unreasonable, and I'll go so far as to say I could recommend, I don't think it would be unreasonable to have a 30-day holding period.
Can I just make another comment, Mayor? Thank you. Under the records to be maintained and daily reporting requirements, again, those are things that are required as a matter of the business itself. Some of these just may give a little bit more clarity. It doesn't necessarily go significantly beyond the state, but those are two critical components that help our law enforcement officers do their job, but it also allows victims of crime to actually have an opportunity to recover items potentially. And if you don't have those two things at a decent level of clarity, such as how they present the photograph, if all they're required to do is put it on a copy machine, and if you get a black piece of paper that you cannot distinguish, there's no opportunity to recover. And so that's why some of that, while it may be slightly different, it's intended to protect those buying the items, because if they're legitimately good items, they should have no reason not to want to have a decent photograph of it. So a lot of that is obviously state law.
So do we have a scale? Do they have to have a scale and a height thing like they do at the doctor's office to weigh and measure everybody who comes in?
Well,
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
I just want to say, from a summing this up, what I guess my takeaway and my work product to come back to you is going to be a revised ordinance, and including a sort of a spreadsheet that on these, I'm thinking primarily of these 4 points. First of all, with respect to the waiting time to get an employee permit, I think Chris's point is we'll take it on that. Just as soon as practicable, there's no need to put in some number. The square footage between uses, we will look at that. Chris will look at that with me, and we'll try to bring you back something reasonable on that.
Linear footage, correct.
Linear footage.
Yeah.
The holding period, I'll provide you some guidance on other jurisdictions and state law. And, of course, the information that the person tendering the pawned item has to provide. I think you all might want to know what state law says to that, maybe what some other jurisdictions say to that, and what we're proposing to that. Those are really the big items that I think are going to get the most scrutiny by a pawn shop looking to locate. I'll do the same for the person.
I know the press has already picked this up, so, I would expect that we will in the next few days hear from pawn shops and others considering.
Which is healthy. I think that's good to hear their input.
It is good to get their input.
So would we consider having discussed both these agenda items, or now we need to move on to precious metals, correct?
Yeah, but they're both the
But
frameworks.
I've got a public comments. I want to give that person a chance to step forward, if that's all right with the council.
Mr. Fred Edwards.
All right, Fred, you got to grab the mic and turn it on. Sorry. There you go. You got it? I got it. All right.
Fred Edwards, 915 Hopewell Place Drive, Milton. Also on the Planning Commission, but I'm here just to speak to the subject of the pawn shops and also precious metals.
Excuse me, Mr. Edwards, are you speaking just individually on that?
Individually, yeah. I've been a coin dealer for probably 50 years. Presently, I trade in gold and silver in Alpharetta. So I don't have to worry about milk. But there's several points that I made. On the pawn shop, don't we have several ordinances presently that say you can have a beauty shop, you can have grocery store, excuse me, but you can't have a pawn shop present?
I mean, in terms of like
Talking about the
zoning.
zoning code,
Under zoning.
it may very well be the case. Wouldn't surprise me.
I believe we have
Wouldn't
several
surprise me.
that say that. The pawn shop, I think you're right on most everything except the timing. as far as, and the distance. They're growing fast for the reason, Julie, that you said. As far as employees, other than the owner, if you say you have to have 45 days to check out an employee, alcohol, you do not, correct?
That's correct.
Anybody can sell it. So I think you'd have to have the same regulation there as you do on the alcohol. There's definitely a difference, Mr. Mayor, from pawn shops to precious metals or a coin shop. Under this, if we took them both in, I would say that if I want to move a 1,000-square-foot coin shop in Milton, I'd pretty well be prevented from doing that. And I don't think that's what we want to accomplish. So I think, Mr. Gerard, that we probably still need two different ordinances. The precious metal, you drive down the street today, as we all know, I mean, they're everywhere. They buy today, they probably sell by late afternoon or in the morning because the market is so volatile that if they pay $1,000 for an ounce of gold, they got to sell it now. Or tomorrow it could be 800. So we have to take that into consideration. Now, I know, for instance, Alpharetta still says for anybody dealing in precious metals, not necessarily coins, but precious metals, you do have to hold, and I believe that's 30 days. And I know several people who, I don't want to say are violating that, but they're buying on one day and they're selling it immediately. If there was just someone who came in and wanted to be in precious metals and coins, they wouldn't be able to buy and sell gold or silver because it's just too volatile. So you would be prohibiting them as a new business coming in. So hopefully I haven't confused you too much, but and I'm happy to answer any questions, but I didn't plan to come here to discuss my hobby, but those are some of the things that we need to look at. But the pawn shops are a problem. One other area, consignment shops are also dealing in gold, silver, guns, whereby I bring in a rifle to an antique shop and say, do you have a consignment? Sure. What do you charge? Well, we charge 18%, and you put it out, and hopefully it sells. So I think, as Councilman Longoria said, you have to look at all our areas here because, you may prohibit somebody who's in the consignment business of antiques would end up also falling under these same ordinances and not be able to do it.
Sure. We got a couple of questions.
Go ahead. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, that was a question I had because as I read this, it says under pawnbroker, it says, the business of purchasing tangible personal property from persons other than manufacturers or regulated dealers. When I moved to Crabapple, it was all antique stores and they were almost all consignment type shops. And they were all purchasing tangible personal property and selling it. Some of it on consignment, some of it not. If you took this literally, an antique store could be subject to this ordinance, and you would have to, only have them every 5,000 feet. That would be a real problem.
Is that a question?
Yeah, I mean, it could be a real problem.
Yeah, I don't, that's not, I think the way the definition reads is it says the business of purchasing tangible property from persons or sources other than the manufacturers or regulated dealers as part of or in conjunction with the business activities described herein. I think it's still anticipated under that definition that there is a pawn transaction where the property is acquired based upon a fixed period of time that it's held. But your point's well taken, and we certainly wouldn't want to have any law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, I just think that this is a little bit too broad. I understand what it's trying to prevent, but I'm afraid it is going to prevent other businesses that we may really want in Milton, like antique shops, from feeling comfortable being in the city. And if they took in any antique jewelry to sell,
Right.
what would they do? I mean,
Silverware.
yeah, I mean, so yeah, anything like that. I mean, it could really, because a lot of antiques happen to be, silverware and servings and stuff like that. I think we've put a huge tarp over what we need an umbrella for, so we need to be careful.
And I've made a note in the definition section. I think if we stop that definition after the words "within a fixed period of time," period, I think you're probably going to be okay. But I understand the point.
Julie, you have a question?
Thank you. And to Karen's point, obviously that's not the intent of this,
No.
and we already have an existing definition of pawn shops. So I think if anybody were to interpret an antique store as a pawn shop, the regulation we have on the books would already have presented a problem. That's not the intent. So Ken, thank you for adjusting any of those definitions to address that. I would like to just speak, Fred, to your point about precious metals. Is it the reality right now? And so however you and Chris work on this between now and next Monday, is that today if somebody robs somebody and they take a bunch of those items, and if they're metals or jewels, and take them to a gem buying location, if they don't have the regulation of having to hold them for 30 days, they can melt them down, and then somebody has no opportunity to recover those.
That's correct.
And so whether it's a pawn shop or a gem buying or a gold buying location, there does still need to be that same holding period. So it's not meant to preclude transactions, but it is meant to protect those who unfortunately get to be the victim twice, because you get robbed, and then if you don't have an appropriate holding period or an appropriate reporting period, there is no opportunity for recovery. So it's finding that balance, and I appreciated, Chris, your point that 30 days remains reasonable. And Fred, just to your point, is that the intent in having both is that unfortunately, the criminals today are finding the opportunity to sell those stolen goods at both of those locations. So you've got to be able to address it in either of those locations so that our officers have an opportunity to try to recover.
I want to thank you, Fred, for giving your input. I think we've gotten a lot of different perspectives. I feel fairly confident that Ken and Chris have got a grasp of the concerns that we have. This may not be something that I'd like to, so I have the council charge you guys to look into this and see if you can get something that makes sense, you feel comfortable with, for the intent that the council has here. And if not, we may have to revisit it, and work on it some more.
Well, I've gotten a lot of, I think I've got a good sentiment of the council, so I appreciate it.
While you're doing that and looking at it, you hear it says interest in a pawn shop, and it says his or her family is the outright owner. I mean, the IRS has 4 or 5 different definitions of what constitutes family. I think that's got to be defined. Is it your second cousin on your father's side, or is it immediate family? Or family is too broad.
Okay. Thank you.
And that was in her interest in a pawn shop.
And and it just says family. I mean,
That's a good point.
yeah.
All right, and we want to call the next item, which we reversed a little bit, but just for formality, do you need to
No.
do anything?
We noted that.
All right. I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you for your comments and input, Fred, and everybody else here. And I think we've got a little bit of work cut out for our staff, but we probably all want to see the same outcome. Thanks.